Okay, hi everyone. So this is going to be our first introduction lesson to Blender. You can see that I've got Blender 2.9 installed here, it says up on this introduction image in the top right corner there, and I'll put the download link in the description of the video. So if I just left click here, that screen will go away, and now we're looking at the basic interface of Blender. Now in this tutorial, what we're going to do is kind of go from start to finish with some of the simplest animations we can possibly think of, just as a way to start to explain the interface a little bit. There's, if you click through all the different menus on the side here and up the top, there's so much inside this software, but what we're going to do to get started is just make a very simple animation, and in doing so, start to learn some of the interface. I'm also going to link in the description some other more professional Blender tutorials that explain the Blender interface in more detail. But let's just make something and see how we go. Okay, so as you can see, when we start a new Blender file, there's a few things there by default. And you should be able to just watch my keystrokes and my mouse clicks in the bottom right corner. Okay, so if I left click here, we've got this cube, and we can see here in the scene collection area in the top right, it picks up the cube when I click on it, and there's a light, which is this light here, and there's a camera. So you can really think about this already as sort of like a virtual film set. The cube is like the character, the light. Every time you use a camera, you have to have a light pointing at something so that it won't be too dark. And then we have the camera, which is what looks at the cube. Okay, so if I click there are all these tabs up the top, and what these tabs do is they basically change the configuration of the tools in Blender to allow you to quickly do some different sort of functions. Most things in Blender can be found without changing these tabs, but think of these tabs as sort of like automatically reconfiguring your work environment to something more convenient. When we're usually just 3D modeling, we might be in the modeling area, and today we're going to use the animation tab here. And when I click on the animation tab, you can see that we've got two views. Here, this is just our default workspace, and over here is what the camera is looking at. If I zoom out, we can see that it's framed here by sort of the bounds of the camera. Now, when I zoom in and out, I'm just using the middle mouse wheel. When I click on something, I'm using the left mouse button. And now here, if I click the middle mouse button, you'll see that all of a sudden we've lost that box around the camera. And what that means is that this camera is no longer what this window is seeing. This window has become a little bit like this window. It's just sort of looking at stuff without having a camera. So we don't know what our final video would look like. So here we always want to make sure that the camera is what this view is set to. So to reset it, it's quite easy. You look at these three lines here, view, cameras, set active object as camera. Now you'll notice that that works because I have the camera selected here. So I'm going to select the camera, view, cameras, set active object as camera, and now we've got this view back again. So straight away, let's show how to get something out of Blender. How do we get out an image or a movie? So let's do an image first. I'm going to go to render and render image. Now rendering, you've probably heard this word before in if you've edited videos and such. Rendering is when we take all the operations that we've done in the editing software and we process them out into an exchangeable file, like a JPEG image or a MPEG-4 video and so on. So we've got two options, render image and render animation. We'll come to render animation in a second, but I just want to render out an image of this cube. I'll click that button, and okay, there we have a very exciting image of a cube. Now I can just go image, save, and I can save that image as a JPEG or PNG or any type of image that I want. Okay, so let's just make this a little bit more interesting. First of all, let's change the color of the cube. So I'll click on the cube, and now we have this workspace over here. I believe this is what we call the properties menu. And check it here, yes, properties menu. Okay, now if you hover over most things in Blender, like any good piece of software, it'll tell you what all of these tabs are. And I expect at the moment that a lot of these words probably won't mean much to you. Modifiers, particles, and so on. But we'll come to most of these during the course. But first of all, we want to change the color of the cube, as I said. So, okay, let's click here, material properties. A material is what gives a 3D object its visual properties. So if we zoom into this cube, it's not telling us much right now, you know, it's just a gray cube. But if my mouse is giving me a lot of overlay here. If I go into the materials tab here, it's already got a material of its own, this just default material. And I can just click into the base color, which is the main sort of color that will go into this cube. If I click here, oops, sorry, click on the white area, and let's just make it, I don't know, pink. Okay, so far nothing's happened, at least that we can see in the viewport. However, something has happened. I'll just have to show you where you will see this change. If we go into render and render image again, okay, there's our pink cube. So the final rendered version of the cube is pink. But we can change our viewport settings so that we can also see the fact that the cube is pink. Right, so there's a couple of ways to do that. In the top right hand corner, there are these little circles with different patterns on them. If I click the first one, it puts us into what's called wireframe mode. So it's just showing us the geometry of the cube. And when we start learning 3D modeling next week, this geometry will be very important, and we will turn a cube into something far more complicated. If I click this one, we go back to the gray plain cube. If I click here, this is what's called the, I think it's the material preview mode. We can see the pink, and I'll click the next one. This is the rendered view. And at the moment, the rendered view and the material view don't look that different. You'll just notice that the lighting is a little bit different. And as we get into rendering and, you know, making more kind of beautiful or photorealistic images later in the course, the difference between rendered view and material preview will be quite obvious. But okay, so if I render image, we've got our pink cube. Okay, so now we've worked out how to render an image of this cube. Let's make a movie. Let's make a short animation. Perhaps I should tell you a few things about moving the cube. If I press the letter N, we're going to get what's called the transform menu. A little thing pop up here on the side. And it tells us all sorts of information about the cube. The location tells us where it is. And if I left click on here and drag it, you'll see that we can move the cube in space. We're changing its location on the x-axis, or on the y-axis, or on the z-axis. And theoretically, when we start talking about space in class, all of these systems we will look at in a historical sense as well. But okay, so you can see now that the cube on the camera side here is in a completely different position. Now, a nice little trick for Blender, if you want to reset these, you can, you know, put 0 in and press enter, but you can also just hover your mouse here and press backspace, and that will reset everything to the default 0. And the rotation, same thing. We can slide these values and rotate the cube. So for an animation, what I'm going to do is just make the cube spin around on the x-axis like this. So when we're talking about an animation, we're talking about something that changes over time, so that the beginning of the video is going to be different to the middle and to the end. And we make these differences by what's called keyframes. Down here, you might have noticed that we have a timeline, this timeline is where we're going to put keyframes. And if you left click and drag the playhead here, what it's doing is showing you different parts of the animation over time, different frames, and you can see this number here changes as I drag it up and down. So we can kind of guess that this number here is the position in the animation, and Blender, we measure that in frames rather than time. Okay, so if we're talking about frames rather than time, we can see that our animation is 250 frames long. Now, if we're thinking of 30 frames per second, gosh, I wish I had my maths better, but 30 frames per second, 30 divided by 50 would be about, I don't know, almost, what are we talking, 8 seconds long or something like that? Close enough. So we don't need anything that long. So I'm just going to change the length of the animation in this panel here. Let's just make it, I don't know, 60. So 60, if we were at 30 frames per second, should be about 2 seconds. And I'm pressing the space bar here to start and stop the animation. And now that the animation is just 60 frames long, it loops back and forth. But we can see that actually nothing's happening yet. We haven't added any keyframes, so every single frame of our animation is exactly the same. So let's change that. I'll go back to frame 1. And what I want to do is, if I want to make the cube rotate, I'll just Control Z to undo that rotation. If we want to make it rotate, I'm going to set a keyframe for the rotation on frame number 1 and another keyframe on frame number 60. And what that'll mean is that the entire animation will be about the cube transitioning from the rotation value of frame 1 to the rotation value of frame 60. Okay, so let's set that up. Rotation, I'm going to right click, insert keyframe. And you can see a keyframe here has popped up on our timeline. And I'll just skip straight to frame 60, type it in there, and I'm going to change the rotation to 360, so it's spun a full revolution around itself, and I have to right click again and insert keyframe again. We can turn on things like automatic keyframing if we want every click we do to automatically insert a keyframe, but for now, inserting it manually is nice and clear. Okay, so if I go back to the beginning and the end, we can see that they're the same, because a rotation of 360 degrees should mean we're back where we started. But if I click on frame 20, we can see that the cube is rotating. And if I drag the slider here, we can see the cube is rotating by itself. Okay, so if I press spacebar now, we have this very exciting animation of a rotating cube. Maybe let's add in one more property. What if we animate its scale? So the scale here is how big the cube is. Okay, so what if, whoops, should have that set to 1. What if on frame 1, I set a keyframe on the scale of X, insert keyframe, and then on frame 60, let's set the scale to 1.5. Okay, insert keyframe. So now we can see that frame 1 and frame 60 are no longer the same. And that's because it's not like we're rotating back to the same position again. We're still rotating to the same position, but the scale starts and finishes with a different value. So if I play the animation now, maybe I'll make that scale change a little bit more exaggerated. Let's go back to this keyframe. Let's change that to 2. Right click and replace the keyframe. Okay, so we can see that we have a cube that is rotating and getting larger. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that as my wonderful artistic creation for now, and we're going to export this, and we're going to export it as an animation. Okay, so we just have to set up a few little things. We're going to go to the Output Properties tab, which is the second one from the top here. I think to me it kind of looks like a printer. So in the output properties, we can set a bunch of things. By default, the resolution of our camera is HD standard video, 1920 by 1080 pixels. So we're going to leave that. The frame rate is set at 24 frames per second. You know, depending on what frame rate you use with Daniel, you can change that to something that's congruent. Oh, look, let's just leave it there for now. What we really want to look at here is the output. We want to know where this is going to go. Okay, so we have to set an output location. So I'll click on this file browser and I don't know, I'll go to my hard drive and I'll just make a new folder that says class 1 frames, class 1 animation 1 frames. Okay, I'll select that and accept. So what that means is that when we render this animation, we're going to have a frame sequence. So we're going to have 60 frames that are going to be exported to that folder. Now we should just check that we're sending the right type of frames out. So if I look here at the format, if I click from PNG, we can export a bunch of different things. We can export a bunch of different images, but we can also export directly some video files. Now actually, when you're working in animation from 3D, you never really want to export directly to video. And the reason for that is that often the rendering time is quite long. Sometimes it can be as long as 1 frame per minute. And so if there's ever any error or if ever anything goes wrong, you will have all of the frames that preceded the error, but also you don't have any compression. Once you finalize something in a video, we're adding in various types of compression, which will remove some quality. But when we're rendering straight to frames, we have the maximum quality of the image in every single frame. Then when we edit the animation, which you're going to do in Daniel's class, you bring in the frames and then you can do whatever you want to them and export your final video. So right now we want to keep those nice, crisp, rendered frames. Okay, let's just render this out right now. So if I go now to render, instead of render image, we're going to render animation. And what that'll do is it will automatically start a process where we render all 60 frames to this folder. So render animation. And okay, now we can see the cube rendering. And we can see the frame count here. It's rendering, it seems to be about half a second per frame. We're up to frame 25, 26 now. And it's giving us a preview of every single frame that's rendering. And if I go to my computer and I look at that folder, we'll see that it's filling up with all these frames. So as Blender is rendering, we're getting a nice frame sequence here. And in Daniel's class, you're going to import this frame sequence, and when you import it, it will play as a video, just like it was in the preview of Blender. Okay, that's finished. Frame 60 is done. Now, before I finish this video, we're going to make one small change. If I show you one of these frames, you'll see that it's got a background. It's got this gray background. Now, to me, if I was going to composite this animation with other things, I don't want that gray background, at least not for something like this. If I wanted to have a rotating cube to be remixed into another video, I'd want the cube by itself. I wouldn't want this default background. So what we're going to do is we're going to render it again, but we're going to make sure that we have a blank background, a transparent background. So I'll close the render window. Now, there's something very obvious I haven't done. I should save my file. File, save, and I will go into my Blender folder here, and I will make a new folder, and let's call it VART3435 Blender, and maybe here I'll have Blender project files. Let's get organized, and I'll call this class 1 rotating cube. All right, nice. Now what I might also do is, now that I've set up my folder hierarchy, is I should probably put these frames, let's get things a bit better organized. So if we had this new VART folder, I've got my frames here. I'm just going to clean things up a little bit. I'll make a new folder. I'll call it frames, and I'll put these frames here. Okay, so now our Blender folder's looking a bit better. We've got a project files and a frames folder. And as the course develops, I'm going to show you how to use a nice kind of healthy, clean file structure to keep your work organized. Okay, so where were we? Making the transparent background. So at the moment, we're getting this gray background. And that's the same gray background of our viewer. We haven't done anything to change this background yet. We can, in the future, do all sorts of things. We can have it be a color. We can use an image as a background. We can do all sorts of stuff. But for now, we just want to get rid of the background entirely. So I'm going to go into the Render Properties tab and going to click this little button down here called Film. And now, what you're going to notice is a lot of the solutions to little things like this in Blender, if you don't know where to find them, you'll be scratching your head for hours. There's two solutions for this. The first one should be Google. Just go online and say how to render transparent background Blender, and have a search around yourself. And that's what I do most of the time. I forget things all the time, and I'm always Googling things to remind myself where certain functions are hidden in Blender. But also, because you're in a class with me, after you've Googled it and looked for it yourself, maybe you can ask your friends, but of course you can also ask me. Because sometimes we can get stuck with one problem for an hour or so. That's really a waste of time. And so because we're taking a class together, you can definitely ask me your problems as well. Okay, so the transparent box here in the Film tab, we're just going to tick that. And look, all of a sudden our background has disappeared, and we've got this checker box pattern, which usually tells us that there's what's called just an alpha transparency, or a transparent background. The second thing we need to test, let's have a look in our output panel. Okay, good. What I wanted to see is that for the file format, we are set to PNG, and a PNG file has what's called an alpha channel. It can carry a transparent background. So that's the file type we want. A JPEG won't give us that. A JPEG will probably try to fill in the background with white or black. And the other thing we want is this RGBA to be selected. RGB means red, green, and blue, and A means alpha. And alpha is just the transparency. So now if I render an image, great. We've just got the cube and a transparent background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new folder. And where did we move things to? Blender, frames. I'll make a new folder called class 1 animation 1 frames transparent background. Okay, nice. Select that, accept. Now I'm going to render the animation again. And okay, so we can see the same cube is rendering. It's rotating around on the Z axis, and it's getting a little bit longer. And we've got this nice checkerboard pattern here, which means that we have an alpha transparency in the background. And what's fantastic about this is all of a sudden we can make new video content that we can layer on top of other videos and really start to have a lot of control over what we make in Blender and how we can use it with other types of video sources. Okay, so let's just have a look in my frames folder, frames transparent, and wonderful. We've got all of these cubes spinning around with a transparent background. Nice. Okay, so that's going to conclude the first tutorial, very short one. Now, for some of you, that might have taken an hour to do. Some of you might find it's very easy, but that's the reason why I'm recording things like this, because I think all of you will be able to learn to how to do all sorts of incredible things with this software, but some people learn quickly, some people are really slow and methodical. But with the video, you can pause it, you can rewind it, and hopefully that will make things nice and efficient for us. In the next video, we're going to not just rotate the cube, we're going to move it around in other ways, and we're going to bring in some other objects that we've downloaded online, and we'll try to make some interesting short video clips that you can use in Daniel's class. Okay, I'll see you all very soon.